Hi, welcome to our second episode of Exploring Gnosticism. Today we're starting with a very interesting question, and that is God male or female? We know that when we hear people talk, when we hear people pray, when we hear scripture being read, we see all the time this concept of he or his or him, and it's a very masculine concept. But the fact is, it hasn't always been that way, and there are, of course, some areas even today, such as Wiccan paganism, which will talk about a female aspect, a more spiritual aspect of the divine. And the question implies that maybe there is something more to this than just a male god. Maybe this being is not just an entity that is a very aged old man with a long white beard, but maybe something more, something beyond. And certainly the Gnostics believed so. They saw God as a dyad, a being that had both masculine and feminine aspects involved within it. Now, where would this idea come from? Well, actually, it's found all over the world, and it's the earliest ways in which we perceived things. When you look at the Eastern cultures, you'll find that there is always the male and female counterparts of a deity. For example, in the Vedic cultures of India, you will see, for example, in this image, you have the figure here, which is Rama, and over here you have the figure of Sita. And so Rama and Sita always come together as the male and female aspect. In this image, we can see the figure of Krishna with his flute, and Radha, his female counterpart. And so Krishna and Radha always come together. You cannot have one without the other. And so the male and the female aspect that come into play. We look at the Greek and Roman deities, you find essentially the same thing, right? You're not going to have Zeus without Hera. You're not going to have Jupiter without Juno. And, of course, the Egyptian culture had both male and female deities, male and female counterparts. Now remember, the Gnostic culture is being created, is being born in Egypt. And so a lot of the Egyptian concepts are going to be there. And within Egypt, while there are the male and female counterparts, there are also certain deities that are both male and female. The chief god in Egypt, Ra, is recognized as both masculine and feminine. Anubis is also recognized as both masculine and feminine. And of course, the Gnostic tradition is a Christian tradition. The Christian tradition grew out of the Jewish tradition. And so if we go back and we look at the earliest days, the earliest stages of Judaism, you'll find that even there, this tradition, which today is seen as the strongest representation of monotheism, actually had the idea of the male and female counterpart. You had Yahweh, the male aspect, and Asherah, the female aspect. So the idea of God being two, of God being a multiplicity, has been there since the beginning, the male aspect and the female aspect of God. But we also see within these philosophical ideas of this tradition that the two opposites are not necessarily two entities, but the two could perhaps be one. And so where would this idea come from? Where does that emerge out of? Well, if we take a look again to the Eastern traditions, to the Eastern world, we have a text that comes out of China called the Daodejing. And the opening lines of the Daodejing says, the way that can be followed is not the eternal way. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. That which is without name is of heaven and earth the beginning. That which is nameable is of the 10,000 things, the mother. He who is eternally without desire perceives the spiritual side of it. He who is permanently with desire perceives the limits of it. These two things are the same in origin, but different in name. Calling them the same is a mystery. Indeed, it is the mystery of mysteries. Of all spirituality, it is the gate. And so, what is one of the most important things that we can perceive? And that is the idea of two being one, the idea of opposites being two sides of the same entity. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus proposed this idea about 500 some odd BC, and he said that opposites are identical to each other. Opposites become opposites. Opposites are co-originating, they're codependent, and opposites are essentially the same entity. We can look at a concept like day and night, and we can see how day transforms itself into the course of night. We can see that you can't really have one without the other. And we can see that it's really the movement or the motion of the heavens that is responsible for that transition from day to night. We could see that life and death, two opposites, are part of the same thing. And so opposites are identical in a sense to each other. And this is a concept that we find again in a lot of different cultures in a lot of different ways. The opposites are a way of us coming to comprehend, of helping us to understand. But the reality is not the opposites, but the unity. And so the male and the female aspect of the divine help us to comprehend different aspects or different parts of the divine, when in reality there is still only that one reality, there is still only that one truth. So there is one supreme, ineffable Tao, according to the Taoist tradition, but yet it can manifest itself in all these different opposite forms: day and night, light and dark, life and death, male and female, and so on. And we see, again, the same thing within the Vedic cultures. There is one God, but that God manifests itself in many different forms, including the male and female aspects of figures such as Rama and Sita, or Krishna and Radha. And within the early stages of Judaism, you would have also had that concept that there is the ultimate deity, but it is recognized as the male figure of Yahweh, the female counterpart of Asherah. That is going to shift, that is going to change. By roughly 1000 BC, roughly around the time of the United Kingdom period in the Middle East, you're going to find that all reference to the female aspect of God is going to disappear. Asherah is going to be demonized, and she will become a figure of scorn, of ridicule. She will be a figure that is cast aside. And God becomes purely male. The cult of Asherah is to be condemned because God is masculine. God is male. And so that idea of the divine aspect being purely male is going to start within these Western religions very early on. But there are some people who try to hold on to that feminine aspect, and a big part of that obviously has to do with what the Gnostics are trying to do, and ultimately one of the reasons why the Gnostics are going to be considered heretics. On another note, you can find that within the early Jewish tradition, here is the idea that before Adam and Eve, there was Adam and Lilith, that there was another figure who was created who was an equal to Adam, not an inferior, but an equal. But Adam, as the story goes, did not like the fact that there was someone who was equal to him. He didn't like the idea that here was this female figure who was demanding to be dominant and lay on top. And so God casts her out and creates Eve as an inferior, as a subordinate. to Adam, thus creating that dichotomy of the male superior, the female inferior. And so that's an idea that, again, develops roughly around the time period of 1000 BC or so. So we see that male-female aspect coming into play. So in the beginning, there is this idea of God as having a dualism of being both the male and the female aspects. But over the course of time, this gets shifted away to where God is a male figure, a masculine being. The philosopher Plato also played with this idea a little bit in a piece called the Symposium. The Symposium, if you're familiar with it, is one of Plato's dialogues, one of his writings, in which he imagines this great party that took place amongst Socrates and a number of other thinkers at the time, one of those being the playwright Aristophanes. And they decide that rather than drinking and carousing at this party, because a lot of them had had a little too much the night before, that they are going to make speeches in honor of the god of love. Speeches in praise of love. And so each one of them in turn gives their own discussion. Well, in this, Aristophanes presents a very humorous piece dealing with the idea that human beings were originally created. And keep in mind, of course, that humans are created in the image of God, as a being that contains both the male and the female aspect. And later, they were split. And so, let me treat of the nature and the state of man, for the original human nature was not like the present, but different. In the first place, the sexes were originally 3 in number, not 2 as they are now. There was man, there was woman, there was the union of the two, having a name corresponding to this double nature. This once had a real existence, but is now lost, and the name only is perceived in terms of reproach. Now, when Aristophanes, or more likely Plato through this writing, uses this imagery, he's calling upon things that obviously have come into light from previous ideas. Certainly, as we saw within the Egyptian context, you have God that is the combination, such as Ra or Anubis, the combination of male and female, and the idea that they can split themselves or manifest themselves into other forms. The Eastern philosophies, the early Jewish ideas. So these concepts are things that Plato, Heraclitus, a lot of the Greek writers would have been familiar with. These ideas would have made their way into Europe through the various trade routes. So he's playing upon these ideas, but they are making sense. And it's promoting the idea because Plato, remember, argues that there is this realm of being, this ultimate absolute truth that exists somewhere else, somewhere beyond, somewhere up there. And that within that is the absolute fullness. But yet what is brought into being in this world are copies of that. There is the ultimate form of humanity that dwells in that other realm. But when it's brought into this world, we have male, we have female, right? We have the opposites. Well, Aristophanes is arguing in this piece that in the beginning we were created in that way, that there were men, there were women, and there were beings that had both elements, that there were the combination of the two. But later he says that the gods had split those beings in twain, so that there were only men and there were only women. So the opposites were brought into being out of this. And what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to find our other half. I think about the imagery that gets used a lot of times. We talk about how we're searching for our other half. We'd say things like, "You complete me," right? When we find our significant other. So that person that we're looking at, that other being is supposed to be the other half or the other side of ourselves. And I think that's a very fascinating idea that we get from that piece of the Symposium. But in any event, we see within the Gnostic writings this very idea that, again, God creates man in his own image. God is that fullness that can manifest itself in both male and female form, the opposites out of the one. And we get that same notion, that same idea as to how we are brought into being, as to how humanity comes into existence. So, when we look at the Gnostic writings, they talk about God as a dyad, a being that embraces both the masculine and the feminine elements. And if we read the Gnostic text, we find that there's a dynamic relationship of opposites that exists within this source. And so I wanted to turn our attention finally to the Nag Hammadi scriptures and look specifically at a piece called Thunder, Perfect Mind. Now, Thunder, Perfect Mind it's almost Zen-like in its approach. But let's listen to a little bit of the wording here. For I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the members of my mother. I am the barren one, and many are her sons. I am she whose wedding is great, and I have not taken a husband. I am the midwife, and she who does not bear. I am the solace of my labor pains. I am the bride and the bridegroom, and it is my husband who begot me. I am the mother of my father, and the sister of my husband, and he is my offspring. Right, so notice the opposites that are coming into play in that section. How can one entity be all of these things? How can one being be first and last? How can one be both honored and scorned? How can, one have a wedding day without a spouse? These opposites come into play in that way. But think about, back to the Daodejing, and you can see that very strong Eastern influence. I wanted to give you one more line from Thunder Perfect Mountain. So don't have time to read through the whole thing, but I would encourage you to look it up and do so on your own. But this one line I think is very interesting. It says, I am peace, and war has come because of me. Well, there we get also that idea of the opposites, right? War and peace. And so war is come, even though I am peace. And that really, I think, makes the whole history of Christianity, the whole history of religion in one line. Right? What is it that religion teaches? It teaches peace. It teaches how we should to get along with each other. It establishes a moral code. It tells us to treat others the way we want to be treated. But yet, throughout history, more wars have been caused by religion than anything else. Right? And so he says, I am peace and war has come because of me. That's, the whole history of religion in a nutshell. So what makes this piece particularly exciting is that it has the female figure offering the revelation. This is something that, is not the only instance in Gnostic scripture where this happens, but in Christianity in general, in religion in general, it's very, very rare to have the female figure who is offering this knowledge. It's probably worth noting that Plato also did this. He talks in the Symposium again when Socrates makes his speech about how Socrates' teacher was the woman Diodema. So the great Socrates is learning from a female form as well. Well, there's a commentary on this piece that's written by Hippolytus, and it describes the divine source, God, as a bisexual power. And he goes on to say that what came into being from that power, humanity being one, is discovered to be two, a male-female being that bears the female within it. So there is this yin-yang nature of revelation that we could reinterpret the Adam and Eve story through. Right? Eve is born out of Adam's side, so that Adam, being one, is discovered actually to be two. He's an androgyny who has the female form within him. So think again about the story that Aristophanes relates to us. Here is the one being that contains both the male and the female, but the female aspect has to be brought into being. It has to be made manifest. And so that's what happens in the Adam and Eve story, is that Adam actually contained both the male and the female, but it had to be split apart. Most of the Gnostic sources which follow this tradition of describing God as a dyad also give a similar description to human nature. They talk about human nature as being masculo-feminine. So there's clear evidence that the Gnostic texts speak of God and of nature in this way. However, when the Orthodox Christians begin sorting the various texts into those that would become part of the New Testament and those that would be kept out, virtually all of the female imagery of God is going to disappear. It's going to be removed. Now, much of the early tradition of Judaism changed over the 8 centuries from a polytheistic system recognizing Yahweh and his female counterpart Asherah to a monotheistic system, which made God purely masculine and condemned this cult of Asherah. Christianity moved in less than 3 centuries from a dyad deity to a masculine deity. Now, anyone who espoused something other than this orthodox view was going to be declared a heretic. Their writings would be condemned, their writings would be burned and destroyed. And that, of course, is why the Gnostic scriptures were hidden away in those caves in Nag Hammadi for so long, and why only within the last 100-some-odd years have we had access to these writings, as I talked about in the first episode. The only thing that's even remotely approaching the idea of the Orthodox tradition within, or this idea rather within the Orthodox tradition, is the reverence that's placed upon the Virgin Mary. That's the only female aspect of the divine that seems to come around. The Virgin Mary, of course, is human and not divine. She's not a goddess, and so monotheism is going to be maintained. But God chose Mary as the vessel. She is the womb through which his son would be born. And the relevance of this is demonstrated in a beautiful 13th century sculpture called the Virge Ouvrante. And I'm going to put an image of that for the people listening on Facebook. I'll put an image up there so you can look at that. But anyway, within the Virge Ouvrante, it's demonstrating that without Mary, redemption would not be possible. On the outside, you have a very simple statue. It's an image of Mary offering fruit to her child. But when you open the piece up, you find that the entirety of the Trinity is contained within it. And so it is through Mary that salvation ultimately comes. So here, the masculine feminine is seen to be enjoined, one emerging from the other, but in the natural rather than the reversed order of the Adam and Eve scenario. You know, that's one of the things that makes the Adam and Eve scenario so interesting, is the fact that it's the female born out of the male. Whereas in the Virge Ouvrante, you see the proper natural form, which is the male being born through the female, once again demonstrating a female superiority in a sense. So otherwise, the sacred feminine is removed from the Orthodox tradition, which then works to crush the Gnostic tradition. As God becomes masculine, the role of or view of women begins to change. Women who were once revered, women who could be leaders in the early church, were demonized under Orthodoxy. They were belittled under Orthodoxy, and their position in power eroded dramatically and very, very quickly. To be female under the Orthodox view of Christianity implied a defect in nature that made one inferior. Now, how exactly this transition took place, how the Gnostics viewed it, we'll find out about that in episode 3.